Hello, for anybody just joining us. It's good to be with you on what's a rainy Monday here in New York City. So I think with that, a huge welcome to Face-to-Face 2025. We are absolutely thrilled to be kicking off another year of the conference season, this time virtually for this coming week before we gather live in person at City College next week on April 16th and 17th. We're really thrilled that you're able to join us for our timely conference kickoff panel, Facing the Future, Arts Education in the Evolving Federal Landscape. So my name is Kimberly Olson. I use she, her pronouns. I am a pale-skinned white woman. My brown hair is worn straight today to my shoulders. I have on a very cozy green turtleneck. I have clear-framed glasses, freckles, and I'm sitting in front of a blurred white wall with a piece of wood art behind it. We encourage you to introduce yourselves in the chat as well. Let us know who you are, where you're zooming in from for today. Although we're currently meeting via an online platform, the Roundtable would like to acknowledge that we work and live on unceded lands. Mannahatta, or the place that is widely known as New York City, exists on the contemporary and ancestral homelands of the Canarsie, Munsee, Lenape, and Wappinger people. These sovereign nations and communities are still thriving here, and we continue to occupy their lands. We'd like to give a moment of respect to them, as well as to the Black, Brown, and immigrant communities which have helped build the city we know today. As we recognize that all of our pasts, presents, and futures are intertwined, we would like to also lift up contemporary Indigenous arts organizations that we can all support and learn from. Thanks. I think my colleague Alex is going to paste those in the chat. Thanks so much, Alex. So I and the Roundtable encourage you to learn more about these organizations, support them with donations if you can. And of course, if there are any resources or organizations that you know of, please feel free to share them in the chat that you might want to highlight for us and others. Thank you so much. So with that, we're going to dive into the housekeeping piece of today. We're so excited to be having our 32nd annual face-to-face conference. And with that, a huge thank you to the conference sponsors for their support in making this possible. If we can go on to our next slide. So this session in particular is brought to you by our conference sponsors, 92NY, Dance Education Laboratory, as well as Disney's Musical in Schools. If we go over to our next slide, you can see here is just some of the incredible sponsors that are also helping to make this 32nd annual conference possible. We are grateful for their support. Additionally, I'd like to share some additional gratitude for the following individuals. The Roundtable is a community-driven organization that really does our best to be intentional and responsive to the needs of the field. And with that, we are so grateful for our conference committee made up of members of the field that really helped put the conference on its feet. Please show our conference committee some love. Their names are shown on the screen. In addition, we're thrilled that committee is led by our intrepid co-chairs, Amy Harris, Shobha Kavanagh-Codiel, and Alexandra Lopez. In addition, I want to shout out our conference coordinator, Alexa Karchok, as well in helping make our 32nd annual conference happen. Some Zoom room reminders before we dive in. If you are having trouble with Zoom, please feel free to send myself or Kinsey Keck a message via the chat. This is a webinar, so a little different than a meeting. Attendees are not able to unmute or be on camera, but you are welcome to use the chat feature to contact us, the panelists, to share a point. We also encourage you, though, to use the Q&A feature found within your Zoom toolbar to submit any questions that you might have. We're going to have some time to address questions at the end of our time together. We'll do our best to gather those up and answer what we can during our time this afternoon. Additionally, as you can tell, this meeting includes live ASL interpretation, as well as automatic closed captioning via Zoom. If you'd like to activate captions, please navigate to your toolbar and click Show Captions. This also might live under your More button, depending on the Zoom version you're using. Additionally, this session is being recorded and will be made available to registrants after the conclusion of the conference. With all of that, as the main convening body for New York City's arts education community, it is a privilege and a pleasure to host sessions like this to gather our community and also to be a conduit for important information. And so with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our conference co-chair and a member of the New York City Arts and Education Roundtable's Board of Directors, Alexandra Lopez, who will kick things off. Welcome, Alexandra.
Thank you so much, Kim. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alexandra Lopez. I use she, her, ella pronouns. I am a winter washed out Colombian with curly shoulder length hair and glasses. I am the Associate Director of Education at Lincoln Center Theater, and as Kim mentioned, one of the conference co-chairs of the 2025 face-to-face conference with Amy and Shoba. We have the privilege of working with the amazing Roundtable staff, including our brilliant executive director, Kimberly Olson, as we are living in choose your own adjective times. I am ever more grateful for the amazing resources and the community offered by the Roundtable. When I look for guidance or I have a naughty question, whether it's at the local or national level, the Roundtable is always the first place I go. Thank you for being a part of this community and joining us for the virtual kickoff of this year's conference with our session, Facing the Future, Arts, Education, and the Evolving Federal Landscape. As we were planning for this year's conference before the fall elections, we knew that there would be a lot at stake, but we had no idea what that would mean. What we did know is that we wanted to ask knowledgeable folks who understand our field to tell us how they saw the future of our work. I am honored to pass the mic to our friend and colleague, Dr. Jennifer Katona. She is the Executive Director of the Educational Theater Association and President of the Educational Theater Foundation, where she works to serve theater educators across the United States with comprehensive resources to build, support, and sustain their theater programs. Who better, right? I also wanted to mention Dr. Katona's new book is coming out on April 22nd, Immersive Arts Integration and a Step-by-Step Guide to Transitioning Your K-8 School from Taylor, Francis, and Rutledge. You can see her full bio on the Roundtable website to see all of her amazing exploits. And with that, I turn it over to you, Jen.
Well, thank you so much, Alexandra. It's so nice to see you. Thank you to Kim and Kinsey and the entire Face-to-Face in New York City Arts and Education Roundtable. And most importantly, thank you to our panelists who you will meet in a moment, and to all of you who are joining. It is never lost on me at 4:09 on a Monday and here on the East Coast in New York City on a particularly rainy day that you are all continuing to commit to your own professional development and learning for the best opportunities for your students and the teachers and the communities that you serve. So thank you for joining us. I hope we will, I have no doubt, have a wonderful conversation that will hopefully answer as many questions as you came here with today. So as Alexandra said, and as you all know, I don't need to tell you that the Roundtable is committed to advocacy work. So when Kim first reached out many weeks ago and said we were going to put together a panel for advocacy, that all seemed straight and in line. And then over the last few weeks, as things started to unfold, the need to share within a safe structure, ask some really important questions, and really think about how this work impacts us. It's an honor to be here to moderate this conversation for all of you and hopefully provide some insights. So our goal tonight is to address the current landscape under the umbrella of three key questions. What is going on? What does it mean for me in terms of our schools, our students, our artists and our arts workers, and our nonprofit associations? And what can I do? And our goal is to leave here today with hopefully some hopeful and helpful tips that you can take back into your specific communities and back to your staffs. We will pause as we can for question and answer, and we have some spaces in the presentation where we'll do some Mentimeter and hear what you have to say and what questions you're coming to this conversation with. We've selected topics that we think are the most top of mind and the most timely, specifically what's happening with the DOE, the NEA, the NEH, and the IMLS. But of course, there's many other questions, so please continue to ask them. And Kim and Kinsey have created a parking lot of sorts, and the hope is that those questions might be able to be answered over the full course of the face-to-face conference. So Alexandra gave a lovely introduction, and thank you. So by way of further introduction, my work with EDTA also allows me to be one of the founders of the Arts Education Alliance, which is one of 5 arts organizations, all committed to making sure that our arts educators in schools have funding, resources, and certification. That was the initial goal when we came together. But over the last few months, it's been really a place for us to rally and speak with a collective voice under the leadership of Amanda Carhouse, who serves as our shared lobbyist and our shared advocate, who I am delighted is on the panel this evening. So I'm going to allow her to introduce herself first, and then we'll go through and have all panelists introduce themselves. My job is to keep us on task, to keep us on time, and to monitor the chat and make sure all our questions get answered. So good evening, Amanda.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for having me. As Jen mentioned, my name is Amanda Carhughes. I'm the Assistant Executive Director for Advocacy and Public Policy for the National Association for Music Education, or NAFME. And like Jen said, I am the lead lobbyist for the Arts Education Alliance. The Alliance was just created and announced publicly just under a year ago. And since that time, we've really been trying to educate arts educators about federal policy issues through blog posts, webinars, conference presentations.
Did we lose her?
Every year. Oh, did you lose me?
We got you right back. You're good.
Okay, perfect. I will have to text the 14-year-old and let him know to get off a device. But I was going to say, we also do an annual survey every year of arts educators to learn how their schools are being supported with federal funds. We have used all of those anecdotes to update some toolkits and a website. I'll put a link in the chat in just a moment to talk about federal funds, how they can be used to support arts education and to help our members be advocates for that funding at the local level. And moving forward, we also are trying to do more at the state level to support our state affiliates with coalition building and developing model legislation to support arts education, so we hopefully can be more proactive in our advocacy moving forward.
Thank you, Amanda. I'd like to now introduce Carson from Arts Workers United.
Hi there, my name is Carson Elrod, he, him. I'm coming from the land of the Lenape and Canarsie out here in Bushwick, Brooklyn. I am a white guy with an oval face, brown hair, and thick blue glasses. It is really, really great to be here. I was co-founder and co-leader of the Be an Arts Hero campaign during the pandemic, which was designed to leverage the power and the platforms of individual arts workers to influence the federal government to stabilize the entirety of the creative economy in the arts sector and arts workers as the floor kind of fell out under everything on one day in the middle of March. And it kind of transitioned from a hashtag campaign online to us, getting Billy Porter on Seth Meyers and BD Wong on Good Morning America. And then we moved from there into actual lobbying and advocacy, where we would be on the phone, on Zooms, on Google Meets all day, every day with Congress. And we were part of the coordinated effort that led to the Save Our Stages intervention, which was a $16 billion intervention for live venues. COBRA subsidies, expanded unemployment benefits, etc. And then in 2022, our lobbying led to the House of Representatives convening its first ever hearing contemplating the entirety of the creative economy. And it was called The Power, the Peril, and the Promise of the Creative Economy. And on the other side of that, we thought to ourselves, do we want to continue with this work or not? As the world was opening back up, our all volunteer organization started to have its volunteers go back to work, thank goodness. And we decided to stick around. And we thought to ourselves that the creative economy and arts workers deserved a 501c4 membership organization like the AARP, like the NRA, like the ACLU, that was a membership-based organization that could interact directly with the legislative bodies federally. And so that's kind of my 3-minute monologue about where I come from. And I do want to just say that I am so heartened to hear from Amanda that their organization is fairly new. We're fairly new. One of the things that happened as a result of the pandemic is there are a lot more voices in arts advocacy right now than there ever were before. NEVA, which was the champion of the Save Our Stages, they did not exist until the pandemic. There are dozens. And I think that is something that we should start this conversation on. That's a very nice, hopeful note to know that there are more people in this work right now than there ever have been.
Thank you, Carson. And not only more people, but coming together collectively, working together towards the same goal, which is also a nice result of that work. Jessica from National Council of Nonprofits, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here. And while I'm calling in from Washington, D.C., I am a born and raised New Yorker. I'll always rep Queens everywhere I go. And a little bit more about the National Council of Nonprofits, like what we do and how we do it. So essentially, we champion, connect, and inform the nonprofit sector, specifically 501c3. And how we do it is through our network of state associations of nonprofits. So specifically in New York City, you may know Nonprofit New York or the New York Council of Nonprofits. And working with counterparts from across the country, we get to advocate for nonprofits in all 3 branches of government: judicial, legislative, executive. And we get to do it at every single level, so federal, state, and local. And it's a lot to keep track of, but more than anything, it lets us know what are the trends affecting nonprofits and communities, what trends can be very proactive about or be a little more reactive to. And I think these last few weeks, more than anything, it showed that a lot of the coalitions, a lot of the advocacy from the last few years really paid off, because it lets us know where the executive orders coming through, where the legislative updates that we need to keep track of, how do we stay connected with each other. So it's really good to know that a lot of the advocacy that has already been building up not only continues, but that there will be more advocacy in the future and future coalitions to work with.
Thank you so much, Jessica. So that's a little bit about who is on the panel. Kinsey has a Mentimeter that we're going to toss up. We want to know a little bit more about who came to the panel. So I think you have that, Kinsey, to share, with the prompt being, what brought you to today's kickoff session? It will arrive any minute. There it is. What brought you to today's conference kickoff? If you haven't used Mentimeter before, you can see the instructions on the top. Sign at menti.com, use that code, and then your responses will populate. These are helpful for us to acknowledge what we already plan to cover, what else can we weave into the question and answer period, and what might be useful for the remainder of the conference that you do together. Some folks are also putting it in the chat. So if our facilitators are able to also, our panelists to look in the chat, you might see some other questions that we can try to address. Here's a good one to kick us back into our conversation, but face-to-face is my restorative, happy place where I connect with other theater and arts people. And for once, I don't have to explain, justify, or fight for theater education. So I know face-to-face is an arts education. I'm a theater educator. I resonate and feel close to that one. So I'm going to take that as we jump back into our conversation. There's quite a few more down here, Kinsey, scrolling. Seems to be at a good stopping point, Kinsey. So if we want to unshare. So we said that we would frame this conversation under 3 questions. The first question is, what is going on? And so we're going to start by having Amanda share with us what is going on with the U.S. Department of Education. I'm being a little flippant with that what is going on statement, but we know there are some big changes and some big executive orders coming through from the president. And Amanda's going to walk us through what that really means, some facts around that, and then we'll break that down into what does it mean for all of us. So Amanda, can you please share with us your insight?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. It has been a flurry of activity since President Trump took office on January 20th. I'll admit I've been working in DC doing policy work for over 25 years, and we've never seen anything like this before, with it coming so fast and in every single issue area under the sun. So just education is just like one piece of what's happening in DC, but it's still been quite a lot for those of us who work exclusively in that space. So I think we all know the first action on Inauguration Day was when the president signed his executive order on ending radical and wasteful government DEI programs. So since that time, the Department of Education's removed a lot of content from its website that housed DEI resources. It's also canceled a number of grants, mostly related to research and in teacher preparation programs. We've had a number of lawsuits blocking enforcement of some of these executive orders and also the memos and letters, and they are all in various levels of consideration and appeal right now. So everybody is just kind of waiting with bated breath to see what happens with all of that. The department also launched an End DEI portal a few weeks ago where parents, students, teachers, even community members can be submitting reports of discrimination based on race or sex in publicly funded K-12 schools. They say that they're going to use these submissions as a guide to identify potential areas for investigation. And I think we're likely to see sort of a chilling effect in schools across the country. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The most recent action actually took place last week on April 3rd. The department sent a Dear Colleague letter to state and school district leaders, asking them to confirm the elimination of DEI practices that are in violation of federal law or risk losing their Title I funding, which are the funds that are dedicated to schools serving a high population of low-income students. So that memo included a certification letter that state and local officials were told they had to sign and return to the department within 10 days. Now, I will say New York State is the first and I think only state, I haven't looked at my news reel in about an hour now, but is the first state to say that they are not going to sign that certification letter. The letter from your state Department of Ed says that there are no federal or state laws prohibiting the principles of DEI and that the federal government has not defined what practices it believes violate civil rights protection. So a lot of people have been talking in Washington that we really don't know what illegal DEI means. All of these memos, letters, executive order itself have not actually included a definition. So it's just very unclear right now. So in addition to the policies, I think the really big elephant in the room is what's going to happen to the Department of Education itself. We had all been anticipating an executive order around abolishing the department. The president talked about it on the campaign trail. It was mentioned during the confirmation hearing for his Secretary of Education, and he essentially said that he hoped she would be the very last person in the position. So he did sign an executive order on March 20th. Directing the secretary to take all necessary steps to facilitate the closure of the Department of Education and return authority over education to states and local communities. And then the next day, and I think it was a press briefing at the White House, he also announced his immediate intention to transfer funds from the Department of Ed related to special education services and educating students with disabilities to the Department of Health and Human Services, and to transfer the student loan portfolio to the Small Business Administration. That has not happened. He cannot do that without the approval of Congress. And I think that's the thing that's kind of missing from the conversation sometimes. He's been making lots of big pronouncements. People are a little confused about what it all means, but it does require an act of Congress to completely close the Department of Education and to transfer the funding and those functions to other agencies. We have heard that the chair of the Senate Help Committee, that's Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, that he is planning to introduce a bill to abolish the Department of Ed. We think that it may look similar to another bill that had been introduced in the last Congress, which would essentially transfer all of those functions to other agencies. They do talk about IDEA and all of the special ed services going to the Department of Health and Human Services. But under that bill, the student loan portfolio would transfer to the Department of Treasury, not the Small Business Administration. And then it talks about a block grant for K-12 programs going directly to state agencies and on a formula basis. Really just looking at student population, not even the need of the student population, and then leave it up to states to determine how that funding would be distributed and what are the allowable uses of funding for that funding. The last thing I'll mention really quickly is that the Arts Education Alliance has taken a position in opposition to the closure of the Department of Ed. We are supporting the Department of Education Protection Act, which Congresswoman Hayes, who is a former National Teacher of the Year, has introduced and have an advocacy campaign out to our members, urging them to contact their members of Congress and ask them to support the Hayes bill and to oppose any proposal that would eliminate the Department of Ed. One
Thank you,
other thing
Amanda.
I'll mention
Yeah,
really
go
quickly.
ahead, go ahead. I had a couple follow-ups, but go
Sorry,
ahead.
I was
Yeah,
like, oh,
no,
I
it's
keep
okay.
thinking of more. Is the other piece is that they have finally completed funding for this upcoming school year. The FY 2025 funding is for the 2025-26 school year. We are anxiously waiting to hear how the department plans to distribute that funding and when. It usually goes out, the main bulk of the funding goes out to schools on July 1st. And so we're just waiting to see how that process moves forward and then starting to think about funding for the next school year.
So I know we have another section on what it all means, but I just wanted to get clarifying answers, Amanda, on a couple of things you said. When you started at the beginning saying they're canceling, some of the executive orders are canceling grants, and that there were some court cases that were appealing those. When that happens, what happens to the grants? Does the recipient, is it frozen? Do they still receive it while it's tied up in court? Can you just talk to us a little bit about what happens when that?
I think it's been different with every case, Jen. It's been so hit or miss. So the case I'm most familiar with is the one around the teacher prep grants, and that only froze the elimination of funding for the grants that were in the states of the attorney generals that filed the lawsuit, and only related to two organizations that had grants. So it was the Association of oh gosh, the colleges of teacher education, and then also the National Center for Teacher Residencies. But that case just went to the Supreme Court, and we learned on Friday evening that they're kind of letting the Trump administration move forward with that. So but it's very different. In some cases, their injunction is allowing the grants to move forward, but then we're still hearing stories from grantees who said they never received the funding, even though the court said they should be able to receive the funding.
Not the answer I was hoping for to share with everybody. So in the staying within our context of what is going on, we're going to turn it over to Carson to tell us a little, Carson and Jessica kind of tag teaming this, to go over what we've been hearing around what's happening with the NEA, the NEH, and the IMLS. Who's
Yeah.
going to go?
So just to tag on to what Amanda was saying, everything has been absolutely chaotic and everybody is kind of running around trying to play defense. What's great is that there are people all around the country that kind of like looked at Project 25, anticipated the executive orders, and kind of put together lawsuits anticipating a lot of these actions. And so what's happening is this flurry of activity coming out of the White House. As Amanda noted, a lot of these things are like, okay, the executive order says this. You can't do that. That's not how this works. That's not legal. That's not constitutional. The executive office is not who is in control of that. So those are things that are happening. But at the same time, when Elon Musk and Doge come into your office and literally take over the computers and shut things down and take away your key card and escort you out of the building, it really doesn't matter about a lawsuit or what's on paper, because what is actually happening is what is happening. And speaking of what is happening is Doge is going around dismantling much of the federal government. And so it was only a matter of time until, arts and culture and education were in the crosshairs, because we knew they would be. And so, it was about a month ago when the Secretary of Labor, Keith Sonderling, basically came in with the Doge team at IMLS and unceremoniously laid off about 80% of the workforce. And then, like a week later, essentially just shut down the building. Nobody was allowed in. Like everyone there is now on administrative leave. So with a lot of these things, Letitia James and 21 other attorneys general have filed lawsuits saying you can't do that. You got to open it up. You got to bring these jobs back. Encouraging along that line is the head of the National Labor Relations Bureau was one of the first people fired, sued, contested it, and went back to work yesterday, right? So a lot of what's going on is this kind of chaotic seesaw of activity, of things happening and then unhappening, nuclear scientists being laid off and then being asked back, et cetera, et cetera. So it is a very, very chaotic moment. Last week, Doge arrived at the NEH and immediately wanted to lay off 70 to 80% of the staff. And then that same night at around 11 o'clock at night, and sometimes later, about 56 state councils for humanities got emails from a non-government address, from like a Microsoft Outlook address, that said all operating grants are canceled. Now, some of these grants were like 5-year operating grants, leaving a lot of these states' councils on humanities like in instant economic chaos. And so the word on the street is it's only a matter of time as it pertains to the NEA. There is hope because Marianne Carter, who is running it, ran it during the first Trump administration, has a nice relationship with the White House and the president. And there is this America 250 celebration that the president wants to do. And that's basically just rah, rah, hooray, America. And he thinks that the NEA might be a good agency to facilitate this celebration. And so that might mean that there is some protection there, but also we are seeing that the left hand doesn't always know what the right hand is doing in this administration. And if Elon Musk and his chainsaw walk into the NEH or the NEA, I don't know if I'm Generation X, so I don't know if anybody's going to know this reference. In Die Hard, the movie, at the beginning of the movie, you have like one of the German terrorists who's like carefully trying to like wire the communications while one of his co-terrorists with a chainsaw is like going through all the tubes with the communication cables. And so that's kind of what this moment feels like, is that Elon Musk and Doge are just walking through Washington, shutting everything off. And so where we are is we are in hell. We are in chaos, and we are in a moment of the tsunami is in. The wave has not come out. We do not know what's going to happen when the dust settles. What we do know is that we are in the midst of the storm right now, and we are witnessing people losing their jobs, grants being frozen, key resources being shut off. And you all know much better than I do exactly what impact that is having. So that is the where we are, and I do want to get to the what it means and what we could what we can do about it
Yeah.
too, because
I'm gonna
there is hope.
There
There is
are some things on the other side of that tsunami. So I'm going to
oh
toss it to
actually there's one thing that I should, because this technically is part of what's happening and it is a hopeful thing, is so during all this IMLS NEH stuff last week, Senator Jack Reed started passing around an amendment for the upcoming spending bill. And the idea of this is he saw what was coming and he was like, okay, well, if Doge and the president start yanking money here, maybe there's a way around the side to get money in. And so the amendment essentially says we can preserve all the funding for the NEH, NEA, and IMLS, and maybe even expand that funding as long as it is revenue neutral, meaning that's reallocated resources from other places within the budget. Now, that's hopeful. That's great. The only thing is, if by the time that spending package gets passed, if these three entities are essentially incapacitated, then what would that funding even mean if the lights are off and nobody's home?
Yeah, I'll take a step back and just kind of because I realized over the time that not everyone knows exactly how different dots are connected. So taking that step back to what exactly are executive orders and why we're so hyper fixated on them from time to time is that they really are just directives to the agencies on how to carry out different priorities for our president. So oddly enough, like it's not unusual for a new administration to start with a lot of executive orders to have different priorities. And a lot of the times it really comes down to maybe like a task force or some kind of study. And why the courts get involved is that these executive orders do have the force of law. And how Congress plays into this is that Congress can pass legislation to overturn the executive order. However, it can't pass legislation to kind of follow through an executive order, as Amanda talked about with the Department of Education. While the president cannot dissolve it, Congress can. So these things are pretty connected. And what is going on? We're going to hear a lot of words these next couple of years. And we're not in law school, but I feel we'd be pretty familiar with it by then. So administrative stay, temporary restraining order, and preliminary injunction. So as the executive orders get signed, then the agencies had to figure out how to carry out those executive orders or how to implement them. So sometimes the lawsuit, it's not exactly the executive order, but it's implementation of it. So like a memo, as you probably heard about with the Office of Management and Budgets, like federal funding freeze or little things like that. So once that documentation gets released, to everyone's point, a lot of groups already have an argument ready to go and challenge it in court. So as those things play out, if you hear like administrative stay or temporary restraining order, it means that the court is effectively holding a pause while it reviews the merits of the case. And for a lot of the organizations who are probably following some of these a little more closely, if you hear preliminary injunction, it means that the judge heard the arguments and decided that the harm of allowing that to continue while the court hears it out, the harm is pretty much irreparable. And so it allows things to continue pretty much like business as usual while the decision plays out. So I've already followed like maybe related to NEA funding or NEH. I think with the library services, there's already been a lawsuit filed to kind of challenge that. So a lot of activities will be happening. So those three terms will be heard a lot these next couple of years. And as those play out, it kind of indicates how the judges are reacting to the arguments they're hearing in court. So just keeping those kind of three things in mind, and that it's not just in the courts, it's also in Congress. So a lot of the times right now with deciding the budget process or different legislative pieces, letting them know that this can be in response to an executive order, or simply knowing like where to direct that advocacy.
Thank you, Jessica. I think that's really helpful hearing those three terms. Like you said, we do start to hear those bandied around. And so getting clarity on them was really helpful. So Amanda, what does all of this mean, particularly for schools and students?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little nervous. I won't lie about how all of this plays out. I think the big thing I'm most concerned about is the funding. Even though federal funding is only about 10 to 15% of where schools get most of their resources, it's really intended to be centralized in schools that need it the most. It was meant to be an equalizer. So for schools serving students with disabilities or students from low-income families, homeless students, foster care, English learners, I mean, it really is meant to be targeted to those populations of students who need more support. I think we'll see probably in spring sometime what the president's budget proposal looks like for FY 2026. They've said with their proposal to dismantle the Department of Education that it's not going to impact funding, but they've also only mentioned a handful of programs, Title I, the special education services under IDEA, and Pell Grants. And so some are speculating that we could see a budget with only those programs and everything else being eliminated. The other piece is just how some of these new policies related to DEI might impact the classroom. It's important to note that I mean, other than the funding, they really don't have a lot of control over curriculum in the classroom. That is still the responsibility of states and local school districts. Um, but I think we can see from states that have adopted similar policies, these so-called divisive concepts laws, we know that they've been really difficult to interpret, that they are sometimes causing teachers to limit their curriculum and pedagogical methods. NAFME did a report 2 years ago on divisive concepts laws. We surveyed our members in 2022 and 2023 and just found that it was causing them to feel more burnout, be stressed out, making it more difficult to teach, that it's affecting the climate in the school. And of particular concern to my association, 1 in 5 of our respondents said that they are discouraging young people from going into the teaching profession. And we already are having troubles with recruitment and retention that really had started before the pandemic, but were certainly exacerbated during that time. I know Jen's organization has done some surveying as well about censorship, and that similarly, a number of your respondents said that some of these censorship issues, some of the state legislation is influencing what shows they're selecting in their schools and sometimes making them switch their selection depending on what kind of pressure they're getting from their administration or from parents. I will put in the chat just a link to a blog post that the researchers who wrote our report had drafted around navigating divisive concept laws, just providing some tips to educators that I think might be helpful to the audience.
That is a helpful resource. Amanda, just a couple quick follow-up questions. Yeah. What about the rest of the 24-25 school year budget?
So 24-25. So that's the school year we're finishing right now.
Currently
so
finishing
one thing with most of the federal education programs is that the funding is forward funded. So schools receive the funding July, the school year beforehand. It gets a little confusing. So right now, the budget that just passed was for this upcoming school year.
25-26.
And they really should have started the appropriations season normally kicks off in February when the president releases the budget proposal. We're not anticipating that to come until May. The one thing you may have read in the news, though, is around the ESSER funds. That money, which was emergency relief funding that Congress passed during the pandemic, had to be obligated by the end of September 2024. A number of states and districts received waivers to extend how long they could obligate that funding. They had contracts or were doing HVAC upgrades to their buildings and just needed more time. That money has all been clawed back. And so there's going to be tons of lawsuits around that as well, that Secretary McMahon came in and kind of just said, you don't get a waiver anymore. We're taking the money back because you didn't spend it by the deadline. But all the other funds for the school year we're currently in, schools have and are able to use.
That's good news. I think that's a big weighs heavy on a lot of folks. Sorry, I was looking at my notes real quick. Carson, what does all of this mean for our artists and our arts workers?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we could literally talk about for the next 2 or 3 hours, and I'll just try to keep it brief. Um, Obviously, we have some of the smallest resources federally for the humanities, arts, museums among the free world. You know, Germany has 2 billion a year appropriated, Canada about 2 billion a year appropriated. So the 206 million from the NEA and a couple hundred million for the others is already small, but the impact they have is outsized. On average, you know, $1 of NEA spending leverages back about nine in public and private spending wherever it is. So obviously, to get rid of that is to get rid of the social impact, but it's also to get rid of the economic impact. And oftentimes, NEA grants, NEH grants, IMLS, these are kind of a good housekeeping seal of approval that organizations have that they can leverage to get other private donations and you know organizational, philanthropic support, etc. You know, as it pertains to education, obviously, you know, just for New York State alone, IMLS resources are like $8 to $9 million to libraries. And as noted before, it's going to be the most marginalized and underserved people that are going to get hit the hardest, writ large across the country. You know, the IMLS provides you know, the resources that let rural kids have access to the internet to do their homework, et cetera. So the impacts are going to be broad and hard. Obviously, the states are going to step up and into the breach in some places. You know, a place like New York State, just in its arts budget alone, I think that, you know, there's like something like $350 million. And that's, you know, 147 million more just for the state of New York that it appropriates to itself than the 203 million that goes out nationally from the NEA. So a place like New York is going to survive. It's going to be impacted. There's going to have to be conversations with Hochul and Albany to like step into the breach. But where we are is in this kind of place of chaotic unknowing and reactivity, whether it's lawsuits or trimming down programmings, abandoning programming, shutting down programming. And so we're in a hard spot. I saw some people asking about the state of the lawsuits, and the ACLU, along with others, have joined other parties in these lawsuits as it pertains to the gender ideology executive order, as it pertains to the DEI executive order, and the NEA kind of backed off on both of those. And just like 2 days ago, one of the courts basically dismissed the need for an injunction because the NEA had already walked back what they had been doing. So it is one of these things where it's just day by day, people are trying to figure it out. And the intentional vagueness of some of these executive orders and how they trickle down is really harmful because people don't know what these words mean. Like, what is harmful gender ideology? What does that mean? How do you define that? And so there are people that are kind of preliminarily not wanting to draw the crosshairs of the administration that are saying like, okay, well, this one person show about growing up, trans in Oklahoma, we're not going to produce it because we don't want to risk it. So that's one of the impacts of this too, is we miss out on the vibrant cultural diversity of the nation's artists, arts workers, and their arts product. And then there's other people that just want to make a stand, who say we are so antithetical to these executive orders that we will not even be in relationship with a federal organization that is requiring these things. And so that might mean that a under-resourced organization that really needs those federal dollars takes the brave moral stance to say, we're not participating in this, but then the result is that they are materially harmed and they have to cut programming and jobs, et cetera, et cetera. Like I said, the impacts are broad, but like since we're talking about New York State and New York arts education, the things that are most impactful, I think, are like those IMLS things. And as I said, Letitia James and 21 other attorneys general have brought lawsuits. Basically, this is an interesting thing about the IMLS is President Trump signed signed a law in 2018 which required that funding to be distributed. Right. So there is a Trump law that says those funds they are protected, they cannot be messed with, and they must go out. And then a couple years later, he's dismantling the very organizations that he signed a law to protect a couple of years ago. So we're in a weird place. But my hope is, just as the head of the NLRB, who was summarily fired on day one, walked back into her office yesterday, I'm hoping on the other side of these lawsuits that this funding will be restored. It's just what is happening in
What's going to happen while we wait.
Yeah.
And just real quick, Carson, what is NLRP?
Oh, the NLRB is the National Labor Relations Bureau. It's part of the Department of Labor. It's basically what oversees unions' interactions with management and with government.
Thank you. It's important that we keep the artists in this conversation, particularly around arts education. That's such an important piece of this. It really is a hallmark of our New York City conversations, but for those of us who work nationally, it's such a key piece. Because you're right, we're going to lose those really important stories if we don't keep them centered. Jessica, what does this mean for our nonprofit arts organizations and associations?
I'll start with nonprofits not receiving federal dollars or not intending to pursue federal contracts. I think that gives a lot of freedom to continue telling those stories, either working with productions or finding different ways to continue doing the work that maybe other nonprofits feel a little more limited in doing because of those existing federal grants and contracts. For nonprofits with existing federal grants or contracts, then it's simply revising like language, and we're not telling people that backtrack or little things like that. I think it's more about caution. So revisiting the agreements, what to do if your grant or your contract is terminated, kind of seeing what the funding source is, and then kind of doing more of that like documentation or more of that paperwork. It doesn't sound as like exciting as like, going to advocate, but I think it really comes down to like the operations, just knowing what is in the paperwork. And then if you are intending to pursue those federal dollars, just kind of like making sure what is the latest guidelines. And it is a lot to keep track of, but there are so many organizations kind of keeping track of this, so you don't have to do all of that. So knowing that the latest guidelines, I know right now with NEA and others, because of the existing laws, it's really hard to kind of keep track of that. So I think it really comes down to finding those sources of federal dollars, how much of your budget kind of relies on that, because we have been talking to different funders and just making sure that they understand what's at stake for a lot of groups, because maybe it might sound like a small amount, but percentage wise, if a nonprofit loses that grant, that means they can no longer operate. And I think also knowing that the impact that the arts have in the economy, I think most people have those statistics ready to go. We employ this amount of people. And so telling people who advocate, like in our end, if we know that it's easier for us to advocate to Congress. So just generally for nonprofit arts organizations, just knowing the documentation you have and what to do if you receive that documentation from the federal agency that the grant was terminated, knowing what you're entitled to. Is there a reimbursement or little things like that? For those not pursuing federal dollars, knowing, well, maybe other groups can't be as vocal about, advocating or even lobbying, but maybe we can do that. I think we all have a role to play. And so for a lot of it's been easier to kind of speak up and maybe even challenge these executive orders in court. And that kind of gives some cover to nonprofit arts organizations that cannot do that as easily because of those federal grants and contracts.
So Jessica, just a quick follow-up. You had some good advice, which is if you have a federal grant, to stay on top of what you're entitled to. If you get this letter, kind of know your rights, know your grant. Mm-hmm. How does one do that? How does an executive director or a arts ed director find out?
Yeah. If, let's say, we understand maybe some turnover. So maybe you're kind of new to your organization. You're trying to figure out where the funding is coming from. So depending on the agency, trying to get in contact with that point person or a point person about that documentation around what you're entitled to.
So go back to the grantor. Go to your grantor for the information.
However, we recognize that may not happen quickly because of the reduction in the federal workforce that we have been talking about. So we do know that it will not, a lot of these things, maybe you would hear back maybe within 1 or 2 business days. That's going to be a lot longer. So it's that expectation that a lot of interactions with the federal government will take a lot longer, or that person you had previously thought maybe it's some as your point of contact, they might not be there actually anymore. So I guess also letting people know that have a little more patience when it comes to waiting to hear back from someone at their federal agency.
And what about folks kind of like the 24-25 school year funding? If you've already pulled your funds for the rest of this year, can you spend them?
I would check the paperwork. I would say I cannot give some advice just because, and also this is information.
Sure, flat advice to everybody. Go into Amanda, were you going to share about that?
No, I mean, I know it works a little differently for some of the education related grants that go to nonprofits. There's like a certain schedule of when you can draw down the funds. But for school districts, for most of the federal funding, they get that huge bulk on July 1, and then they get the rest of the funding in October. And so really, other than the impact aid and Head Start programs, schools have that funding and they can use it for the remainder of the school year. It's kind of wait and see what happens with FY 2026, especially for some of those programs like the teacher prep grants that just got eliminated. They funded them in the continuing resolution, but I don't know what's going to happen to them moving forward. So that's kind of what we're keeping an eye on.
And they eliminated them for the future. I think that's an important piece to keep saying.
Right.
So the third piece of our conversation is what's going on, what does it mean, and then what can we do? So hoping to hear from each of you about something actionable, something helpful, and maybe even something hopeful about what each of us on this call can do with our small ecosystem that we have some access to. So who would like to go? Jessica, you've unmuted. Why don't you go?
I would tell folks who work in nonprofits, nonprofits can advocate and they can lobby at every level, federal, state, and local. Lobbying might have some negative connotations to it, but it really just comes down to talking to an elected official or their staff about a bill and convincing them to vote one way or another. And there's like a lot of resources on how to do that, how to file the paperwork and all that other stuff. But if you can, just talk to the legislator, talk to the office, talk to the staff. If a bill comes around to address some of the issues that we've been talking about, making sure that at the state and local level, there is funding for arts groups, you can talk to them about that specific issue and then advocating The best advice I got on this issue on advocacy is who can I talk to today to advance my mission, and just getting creative with that. It could be writing an op-ed, just saying, calling like a call to action, like this is a challenge and this is a solution. Let's all come together to do that. And those two main things I always tell people you can do. As a nonprofit, you can advocate and you can lobby.
Thank you, Jessica. Amanda, what can we do?
I mean, I think everyone attending this session is a great start just to be educated on the issues, to know what's going on is so extremely important for arts educators. I think collecting some data, knowing what the source is of funding for your programs is really important. Knowing what your access and participation rates are for student subgroups is really great data to be sharing with your decision makers at all levels. And then collecting some of those impact stories. So whether it be, the elimination of a grant program or some of these policies around DEI, just being able to share those stories with your legislators, I think is vital to us getting through this challenging time. I'll say I was up on the Hill last week, 2 weeks ago, talking about some nonprofit tax issues, and we heard from one of the staffers who came to the session that the day that they announced the federal freeze and grant funding, and at the time it was everything, including formula grants, like phones were ringing off the hook on Capitol Hill. And a lot of members of Congress got those calls and made calls to the president, to whomever they needed to speak to at DOJ, and at least kind of clarified what programs were being frozen. And it was very much a smaller impact than it could have been. So people were heard.
So we're going to move into questions from the group, the audience, the attendees that are here. We have some already in the Q&A chat, which I'll read and ask you, the panelists, to answer, and then invite attendees to continue to add questions to the Q&A feature in the webinar. So I'm not sure who can take this one, so you all can tell me, but some New York State grants, this particular attendee received a Department of Labor workforce money for arts programming, and they were funded with federal dollars. Any information about specifically how New York State funded programs that are funded with federal dollars are being impacted? I don't know that that's any different than the way we've been talking about all of it, is that it's currently unimpacted, the money is here.
I mean,
And
all
then
I
anything
can say,
after
Jen,
that.
about how it's played out in the education space is that the grantees are the first to know that their grant has been
That's
eliminated or
important.
frozen or impacted in some way. They are getting the email before any notice is going out from the DOJ, from the agency itself. And so advocates are really relying on that communication with the grantees themselves. So I would say if no one has told you there's been bad news, then you can just assume that things are safe for now. But it's obviously things change day to day.
I think that's really important and maybe feels a little even antithetical to some of the things we've said, which is it's a tsunami. We don't know what's happening. Every day it changes. But one thing we can say is you will find out. You won't necessarily be blindsided you might be blindsided and then you might get an email, but you won't be blindsided without being notified.
Yeah,
So
you won't read it in
that
the
is
New York
helpful.
Times
Yeah.
before you're notified.
Yeah.
Exactly. For better or worse, in this case, bad news travels pretty quickly. And so it starts with one text, like, is anyone else seeing this? And then the screenshot of the letter. I would imagine maybe depending on if it's workforce, maybe sometimes the state controller's office has pretty good dashboards, or it's kind of knowing who keeps track of like funding and knowing how much federal funding goes to New York State and specifically to which agencies for that. It's a bit of it's not easy retracing, tracing back to the original source of federal funding, but I think it's worth a shot sometimes.
So there's a lot of questions in the chat around, and so Kim, I'm going to put you on the spot. I'm sorry to do that. There's a lot of questions in the chat, Kim, about how to collectively come together as a community to advocate, and that is something you all are doing. So I don't know if you want to speak at all to what the Roundtable is already doing around advocacy work, because that seems to be the focus of a lot of the questions.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to speak to that. This is Kim speaking. So I will echo what was shared earlier. I think first and foremost, the fact that folks are here, that sharing of information, sharing of resources is a key tenet for me around sort of coalition building and advocacy. That the way that the Roundtable operates is very much sort of along three steps in what this looks like. The point is to educate, to organize, and take action. So right now we're at sort of that educating piece and finding alignment and understanding. I think in terms of taking action, what I feel very heartened by, not only from our panelists, but seeing it in the chat, is seeing folks uplifting different advocacy actions that they are finding unique to the work they are doing, using it as a point to share here. And I think on our end, transparently, we can't do everything as an organization. And I think to what Carson was saying earlier, this is a very chaotic time. So on our end, we are doing our best to sort of gather information, create convening spaces like these, and then identify where are there opportunities for us to be able to sort of take the lead as we are doing within the city and state to advocate around arts education, funding, policy, protections for the workforce. Then how can we best uplift the work that is happening, whether it be at the federal level or from adjacent advocacy efforts that we know might be of interest to our community. So I will say with that, if there are things that are top of mind for you, if there are actions, please put this as within the chat, follow up with us via email. I'll put my email in the chat as well, that this is very much how the sausage gets made on our end, and that we will continue to be transparent in the sharing of information as we receive it. I'll also shout out tomorrow morning at City Hall, we're going to be gathering on the steps in support of improved transparency and investment in arts education. And we've been successful in actually advocating for a hearing to happen later that morning on transparency around arts education. So this is all a tiered level, like tiered approach to advocacy. It's sort of everything all at once. But grateful, I think, that everybody is here, that this is very much a first and grounding step to be able to take future action.
Thanks, Kim. I knew, as I said, there were a lot of questions saying, how can people come together? And there's already a system in place. So I wanted to make sure that folks knew about the good work that you guys were already doing. And then if there are folks here that are not part of the New York City arts education world and you're more nationally based, all of our associations have advocacy efforts. We spoke earlier about the Arts Education Alliance, which also has advocacy efforts. Some of those are as simple as writing campaigns, or you can write to us and we can help you create a campaign for a specific act in your district or state, and all the way to fly-ins at Congress and speaking right to your representatives and advocating in that way. So there's lots of different entry points. We have a few more minutes for questions, although there don't seem to, oh, wait. Suing the, I'll read it and then you guys can tell me who should. Oh, Jessica is going to grab this one. Suing the government for rescinded grants is expensive. What recourse do smaller orgs have if they want to take legal action, or if they are targeted by the administration for refusing to comply with executive orders?
Yep, I recognize it is a challenge, especially for smaller organizations. So often what would happen is a bigger firm, some groups have advocated, pro bono, so they would approach nonprofits experiencing that harm and asking them if they're willing to be a plaintiff and be represented by a law firm. So the smaller organization would not have to take all of that work on, because it is a lot of work. It is a lot of hours. Like, there's no sugarcoating it. So if a firm approaches you asking you want, to be represented, that is one option. Or if there's a bigger lawsuit happening, you can join and provide some kind of written testimony, or just find different ways to kind of get engaged and just say, yes, I can speak to these challenges. But again, we recognize that not everyone is able to do that out of fear of recourse. So connecting with larger organizations, especially membership-based ones, that's kind of the point of capacity building organizations, or larger organization who can do the advocacy and say, our members are experiencing X, Y, and Z. So if you are part of a membership organization, definitely talking to the advocacy team on what that would look like. Or if you get approached by a firm or a group, that does this kind of litigation, considering what your options are for joining and how to protect you and your staff.
Thank you, Jessica. Amanda, we have a question here that I think you might be able to answer. The question is, are there any details on how or if the administration is proposing funds to states or schools that currently fall into the Title I or Title III or other areas currently administered by the DOE not previously mentioned would be dispersed or overseen in the future non-DOE plans? I think that speaks to, you said that they talked about Pell and IDA and everything else would be eliminated.
They've talked explicitly about, like I said, IDEA and some of the student loan programs in the K-12 space, which is where both Title I and Title III would fall. The only proposal I've seen is the bill that Senator Mike Rounds from South Dakota had introduced back in December. And under that bill, it would just disperse funds on a formula based on student population. Interestingly enough, it's the student population of public schools, private schools, and homeschooled children, and distribute the funds that way to state departments of ed. And that the funds could be used for any activity authorized under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So it would leave a lot of flexibility up to states to then determine how those funds would be distributed to districts and how they could be spent. So there are some concerns that in some of our red states where they're talking a lot about school choice and that we could be seeing voucher programs and really kind of using the funds for that purpose instead of what they were intended for.
Thank you. There's another question here, which we may have, I was going to say, there's one question here that was asked a couple times, but I think we may have already addressed it. So, which is if NISCA funds are being impacted. And I don't know if anyone, Jessica, do you know? You're nodding.
No, I don't have as much details on that one.
Okay. But again, I think you would know if probably our last question with our time that we have is, this is an issue for me. This is reading the question. This is an issue for me personally as a director of theater at a high school in New York City before the rise of the Trump funding apocalypse. It was legal, but is it actually legal for administration to change the arts budget allocation from the New York City DOE? I don't even know. That one we might have to take offline, Neil. It's a really specific question. Sorry, I should have read it. So I'm looking at our time.
Hey,
One
Jen.
of the things, yeah.
This is Kim
Can you
speaking.
address it?
Neil, loop back with us at the roundtable. You can send me an email and we can do our best to address that. I'll say in terms of the NISCA piece, NISCA, for those that don't know, stands for New York State Council on the Arts. We know that this is a very big question that has come up in terms of how these different federal policies might have a trickle-down impact to the state agencies. And I think the general sense is we don't know yet. I know I've heard this question asked of Marianne Carter and in other spaces, and the answers that I've received around it is that they're sort of currently waiting for lawyers and legal to iron out what that might look like. Curious for the other panelists, has that been?
Yeah, I would offer, yeah, and I would offer this, which is we are in a similar, we have there's a collective federal grant that we all work on together, many of us. Same thing, we don't know. It's kind of a wait and see. And our approach has been to be smart, eyes open. Let's plan for if the money were to go away. Let's have our bag packed in an emergency situation. But then let's also keep focusing on the work. So it is kind of an exhausting answer because it puts the onus on all of us to live in two spaces, which is to actively stay present for our teachers, in our case, that we happen to be working for, but at the same time, behind the scenes, creating a plan B, C, D, and E. So that's not maybe the most helpful answer to say yes, or definitive answer, I should say. But that's, I know, how many of us are approaching our grant funding programs right now. So until you hear, we assume that we will continue to do the work, but are smart about making plans. If Carson, Jessica, or Amanda want to add anything to that. So we are nearing the end of our time together. And on that very same note, I've heard a couple different things today that I just wanted to reflect back to people. So I know, Carson, you spoke of the diehard metaphor, and there's kind of this intentional chaos or maybe even a tsunami. And we don't know when people came here for answers, and did we give you the answers you came here for? We don't know. But here's what we do know that I heard and saw tonight is we are a community of people. It's over 100 people who showed up tonight who are all in a similar boat, who are all committed to the work that we keep doing. And so many people here, both at the New York City Arts and Education Roundtable and at our individual associations, and I have no doubt the many associations that are represented here tonight, are busy engaging in this work. And there's an old improv game called Tap In, Tap Out, right? Where you're in a circle, everyone is unified in this circle. And when you have an idea, you tap in and your turn to be in the middle. And then someone else taps you in. Or if you're out of ideas, you can step out and someone else will step in for you. And that's really what this work is about for me. That's what I'm seeing and hearing tonight is that we're all tapping in and tapping out for each other. So some of us are on the front lines listening to every news report, reading every EO. Amanda sends a lot of texts during the day telling me everything that's happening, right? I know, Jessica, you say you worry so your constituents don't have to. And Carson, I know you feel the same. And so for those of you who are listening, who are feeling like you're ready to be in the middle of the circle and want to tap in, that's great. And there are resources for you. And for those of you who want to be on the outside of the circle and want to tap out, I think it's good to know that there are people who are also keeping an eye on things. And you'll get the information as you need it. And the Roundtable is one resources, as are all the associations that we represent and the many others that are here tonight. So I leave you with those final words. I'm going to hand it back. Let me first say, Amanda, Carson, Jessica, any final thoughts or statements before I hand it back to the roundtable to close us out?
Yeah, I would love to just say, over at Arts Workers United, which is BN Arts Hero on Instagram, follow us on socials. One of the things that we do is we are advocacy that you can see. So as these things are happening, we are translating them in real time to you via our socials. I put out explainer videos today. I've just been off the top of my head, but like our scripted stuff is really, really good and really full of information and even video clips and fun things. So follow us there, become a member of Arts Workers United. It's very cheap and like providing a united front to the federal government is very important. Also, there are these hopeful things like the Jack Reed amendment that we were talking about. So feel free to call Gillibrand and Schumer and tell them to co-sponsor that with Jack Reed. And even more than that, if those entities are incapacitated, changing that amendment, which would earmark that money to come to the states. And also, as these federal entities may become compromised, the same federal government that is causing this chaos has the power to end that chaos or address that chaos. And one of those things is Susan Bonamici's Arts Education for All Act, right? Which would provide guaranteed K through 12 arts education to every single person in the United States. So, getting on board, encouraging our reps to join her with that. So I just want to put out that there is hope. There are people fighting the good fight. We're always going to try to provide you with the information in real time, and we always frame it very similar to what we did here today. We talk about what's going on, what it means, and what you can do about it. We're here with you. We are united with you. Stay strong. We are gonna get through this together. It's always artists who have the imagination to build back from these moments. It's us. We are the people who can craft the story, which is the alternative to what we're living in right now. And it's not enough to be in a defensive crouch going, ow, 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 as this happens. We have to stand up, stay strong, and say, this is what the world could be like and provide a more attractive alternative than what we're experiencing right now. And the better we paint that and the more inspired we are at telling the story of the country that we want to live in, the more people will join us and the more people will join our efforts to transform the country into that country instead of the one that we have right now.
Yes, thank you, Carson. Amanda
Jen,
or Jessica, dare you follow that?
I just want to piggyback on what Carson mentioned about the Arts Education for All Act. Even with all the craziness going on in DC, everything being so hyper partisan lately, we got our first Republican on that bill this Congress. Congressman Don Bacon from Nebraska co-sponsored the bill this year. So I thought that was a huge, huge win for the arts community. And I'll just mention that here in New York, we're seeing our advocates at NAFME be more active at the state level and really trying to be proactive around how we support arts education. And so our affiliate had worked on a bill that actually is getting a hearing tomorrow, I think, in the Senate Education Committee, that would essentially ensure that there is a curriculum for arts education for all students in all grade levels in all public schools across the state. So I'll put a link to the public hearing in the chat for you all, but I think that's something hopeful to see going on in New York State.
Thank you, Amanda. Jessica.
I would say everything we just said, or everything we do, the lobbying, the advocacy, it sounds like the easier it sounds, the harder it actually is to kind of get to that point. So I think for anyone who might feel like they're new to this, you might actually have more expertise than you give yourself credit for. So just keep doing what you've been doing a lot of, signing up for newsletters, coming to events like this, talking to people about this. I heard this at this event, or going to conferences, like you will in a couple of days, and asking people, is anyone else seeing this? I know maybe I'm a little more introverted sometimes than I realize. So sometimes it's just having that one conversation, and then that can ripple over time. So I think a lot of what we've been doing, just keep on doing it, or start to give yourself more credit for what you're already doing. Because I think a lot of the work that we do is possible by talking to people at the most local level. So again, just give yourself more credit, give yourself more grace, and just keep following a lot of the work that we do. And that's how we have managed to get a lot of wins, even this last couple of weeks, and we'll continue to get more wins.
That's right. We're not stopping. Thank you, Carson, Amanda, Jessica, for being here tonight. Thank you for your expertise and for just laying it on the line, telling us what's going on, what can we do, and giving us those tangible, hopeful, actionable steps and that little bit of encouragement at the end. I am going to turn this back now over to Kim. And thank you, Kim, for having me as well.
Of course. Thank you for being here. Can we please show Jen, Amanda, Carson, Jessica some love in the chat? I'm already seeing folks with some praise and gratitude. Thank you for breaking down what can feel very overwhelming in such a comprehensive and thoughtful manner. I know I feel energized and excited, and I will say ready to advocate. And if anybody wants to join us tomorrow at City Hall, I've just put a link in the chat. So just talking through what's next up on our end. Tomorrow, 9:15, we're going to be rallying on the steps of City Hall, students, educators, cultural workers, elected officials, calling for transparency and investment in arts education. We're then going to head inside for a hearing at 10 a.m. that is a joint oversight hearing on education and cultural affairs as it relates to equity and access to arts education. This is a huge moment in New York City. We're grateful for the council for holding this. You are welcome to come testify in person, submit written testimony. There's information on how to do that in the link I pasted below. Also, during our time together, I pasted a link in the chat of how to view the live stream as well if you're not able to make it. Written testimony can be those submitted anywhere up to 72 hours after a hearing. It's important that your voice is present and on the record because it matters. Later that day, we're going to continue with face-to-face. And our afternoon session tomorrow at 4 o'clock is going to be Beyond Inclusion, creating arts experiences that center and celebrate disability. That's going to be tomorrow at 4 o'clock, right back in Zoom. And you can see on the rest of our screen the incredible session sessions that we have coming up later this week. And with that, a huge thank you, everybody, for being here. We look forward to seeing you face to face real soon. Have a good rest of your day. Bye, everybody.